Hi there. So before I launch into recording this book, I want to give a quick disclaimer, which is that Red Star Over China was written before the creation and widespread adoption of the modern system of romanization, which is called pinyin. So Red Star Over China uses what's called Hanyu Wei Giles to translate or transliterate Chinese sounds into Romanized letters. It's a really, really outdated and, to be frank, quite poor method of transliterating Chinese pronunciation. When I went to university, took a module that included learning how to convert Hanyu Wei Giles into modern pinyin, but it's been a while, and I was also never particularly good at it. So if I make a bit of a slip up here and there, then please forgive me. Also, if for whatever reason I end up saying a Chinese word that sounds like a sort of Victorian British person is trying to pronounce something in Cantonese, it's because I have absolutely no idea how to convert this particular word that's been written in Wei Giles, and instead of possibly giving a wrong conversion, I'm just going to try and pronounce it as phonetically as it's written on the page. So I apologize for that if it happens, but hopefully it won't. Anyway, so here we go. Hope you enjoy. Red Star Over China by Edgar Snow. Preface to the revised edition. Travels and events described in this book took place in 1936 and 1937, and the manuscript was completed in July 1937 to the sound of gunfire by Japanese troops outside the walls of Beijing where I lived. Those guns of July in China opened 8 years of Sino-Japanese battle, which merged with the Second World War. The same guns also heralded the ultimate communist victory in China, which profoundly altered the balance of power, both inside and outside what was formerly called the communist camp. In time and space, this report concerned an isolated fighting force in an area far removed from the West, on the eve of its greatest catastrophe. The League of Nations had been destroyed when it failed to halt Japan's conquest of Manchuria in 1931 to 1933. In 1936, the Western Allies permitted Hitler, still a cardboard Napoleon, to reoccupy the Rhineland without a fight. They impotently watched Mussolini seize Ethiopia. They then imposed an arms embargo against Spain under the hypocrisy of neutralism, which denied the Republic the means to defend itself against reactionary generals led by Franco, who had the open support of thousands of imported Nazi and fascist troops and planes. They thus encouraged Hitler and Mussolini to form an alliance ostensibly aimed at Russia, but clearly intended to subjugate all of Western Europe. In 1938, Hitler was allowed to swallow Austria. He was then rewarded by Chamberlain and Daladier with Czechoslovakia as the price of peace in our time. In compensation, they soon received the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Such was the international environment of China when this journey was undertaken. Domestic conditions inside that disintegrating society are defined in the text. In 1936, I'd already lived in China for 7 years, and I had, as a foreign correspondent, travelled widely and acquired some knowledge of the language. This was my longest piece of reportage on China. If it has enjoyed a more useful life than most journalism, it is because it was not only a scoop of perishable news, but likewise of many facts of durable history. It won sympathetic attention also perhaps because it was a time when the Western powers, in self-interest, were hoping for a miracle in China. They dreamed of a new birth of nationalism that would keep Japan so bogged down that she would never be able to turn upon the Western colonies, her true objectives. Red Star Over China tended to show that the Chinese communists could indeed provide that nationalist leadership needed for effective anti-Japanese resistance. How dramatically the United States policymaking attitudes have altered since then is suggested by recalling that condensations of this report originally appeared in the Saturday Evening Post and Life magazine. Other circumstances contributed to prolong the utility of this book. I had found Mao Zedong and other leaders at an especially favourable moment, in a lull between long years of battle. They gave me a vast amount of their time, and with unprecedented frankness provided more personal and impersonal information than any one foreign scribe could fully absorb. After my second visit to see Mao Zedong in 1939, all the red bases in northwest China were blockaded by nationalist troops, in their rear and cut off by occupation around the guerrilla areas. For another 5 years, while no foreign newsmen were able to reach Yan'an, the red capital, these reports remained a unique resource. Much of this work is history seen from a partisan point of view, of course, but it is history as lived by the men and women who made it. It provided not only for non-Chinese readers, but also for the entire Chinese people, including all but the communist leaders themselves, the first authentic account of the Chinese Communist Party, and the first connected story of their long struggle to carry through the most thoroughgoing social revolution in China's 3 millenniums of history. Many editions were published in China, and among the tens of thousands of copies of the Chinese translations, some were produced entirely in guerrilla territory. I do not flatter myself that I had much to do with imparting to this volume such lessons of international application as may be drawn from it. For many pages I simply wrote down what I was told by the extraordinary young men and women with whom it was my privilege to live at age 30, and from whom I learned, or had the great chance to learn, a great deal. In 1937, when Red Star over China first appeared in England, there were practically no sources of documentation for most of the material presented here. Today, many foreign China specialists, helped or led by Chinese scholars of different political colorations, have produced dozens of works of varying importance and quality. With an abundance of new information available, aided by my own and others' wisdom of hindsight, many improvements might be made in the text to minimize its limitations, and yet deprive it of whatever original value it may possess. Therefore, it was my intention to leave it as first written, except for corrections of typographical errors and mistakes of spelling or of factual detail. That hope has not proved wholly practicable, and departures from its fulfillment are acknowledged below. Since Red Star over China was completed under conditions of war, I did not have the opportunity to see or correct galley proofs of the first edition, nor have I been able to do so with subsequent editions until now. In extenuation for one kind of mistake, my handwritten field notes contain many names previously unknown to me, and I could not always get them down in Chinese characters. Phonetic transliterations into English resulted in misspellings as judged by Wei-Jiao's standards. These have now been, I hope, uniformly corrected. Aside from that kind of conformance, I have widely altered former present tense verbs to past tense in order to eliminate many seeming anachronisms and make the story more accessible to contemporary readers. Where the book quotes or paraphrases the testimony of others, the wording of the original text has generally been preserved to avoid tampering with a priori historical material, even when it conflicts with more believable information now available. In a few instances where secondary material has been proved manifestly inaccurate, I have cut or corrected rather than perpetuate known errors. In either case, readers may refer to the biographical notes or the notes to this edition to supplement or modify some textual facts or opinions. Here and there, with a certain macabre sense of looking backward on myself, I have reworked lines which the passage of time, or murky writing in the first instance, has made unintelligible to me. The great bulk of the volume, all the happenings, the main travel notes, interviews, and Mao Zedong's, remain intact. Such liberties as I have taken in shortening, condensing, or discarding tedious accounts on a few matters that no longer have importance helps to make room for the chronology, an epilogue, new footnotes, and some heretofore unpublished documents, chapter commentaries, and some fascinating lessons of history in the form of biographical sequels to the early life stories of the truly extraordinary people first introduced here. Cuts of paragraphs and even whole pages necessitated composing new transitional passages. Such spin-ins are confined to knowledge available to me no later than 1937, and the same applies to page footnotes, but not to the end of book materials, of course. Doubtless this tome would not have suffered, and the reader would have profited if I had omitted several whole chapters. Revision was not easy, and I dare say someone less connected with the subject could have done it with less pain to himself and with more grace for the reader. And so, salutations and thanks to all persons mentioned in this book for their help and permission to use their remarks and photographs, especially Mao Zedong, to John Fairbank for taking one more look at these ancient spoor, to Peter J. Seybold for a reappraisal against a background of far wider perspective than we could have known in the 30s, to Enrica Carlotti-Pichel for painstaking scholarship and translating into Italian and bringing up to date the 1965 edition, which inspired this effort, and to Mary Heathcote, Trudy Schaefer, and Lewis Wheeler for assistance and encouragement in general. Edgar Snow, Geneva, February 14, 1968. Part 1. In Search of Red China. 1. Some unanswered questions. During my 7 years in China, hundreds of questions had been asked about the Chinese Red Army, the Soviets, and the Communist movement. Eager partisans could supply you with a stock of ready answers, but these remained highly unsatisfactory. How did they know? They'd never been to Red China. The fact was that there had been perhaps no greater mystery among nations, no more confused and epic than the story of Red China. Fighting in the very heart of the most populous nation on earth, the Celestial Reds had for 9 years been isolated by a news blockade as effective as a stone fortress. A wall of thousands of enemy troops constantly surrounded them. Their territory was more inaccessible than Tibet. No one had voluntarily penetrated that wall in return to write of his experiences since the first Chinese Soviet was established in southeastern Hunan in November 1927. Even the simplest points were disputed. Some people denied that there was such a thing as a Red Army. There were only thousands of hungry brigands. Some denied even the existence of Soviets. They were an invention of communist propaganda. Yet Red sympathizers extol both as the only salvation for all the ills of China. In the midst of this propaganda and counter-propaganda, credible evidence was lacking for dispassionate observers seeking the truth. Here are some of the unanswered questions that interested everyone concerned with politics and the quickening history of the Orient. Was or was not this Red Army of China a mass of conscious Marxist revolutionaries, disciplined by and adhering to a centralized program and a unified command under the Chinese Communist Party? If so, what was that program? The Communists claimed to be fighting for an agrarian revolution and against imperialism, and for Soviet democracy and national emancipation. Nanjing said that the Reds were only a new type of vandals and marauders led by intellectual bandits. Who was right? Or was either one? Before 1927, members of the Communist Party were admitted to the Kuomintang, but in April of that year there began a great purgation. Communists, as well as unorganized radical intellectuals and thousands of organized workers and peasants, were executed on an extensive scale under Chiang Kai-shek, the leader of a right coup d'etat which seized power to form a national government in Nanjing. Since then, it had been a crime punishable by death to be a communist or a communist sympathizer, and thousands had paid that penalty. Yet thousands more continued to run the risk. Thousands of peasants, workers, students, and soldiers joined the Red Army in armed struggle against the military dictatorship of the Nanjing regime. Why? What inexorable force drove them on to support suicidal political opinions? What were the fundamental quarrels between the Kuomintang and the Gongchandang? What were the Chinese Communists like? In what way did they resemble? In what way were they unlike communists or socialists elsewhere? The tourist asked if they wore long beards, made noises with their soup, and carried homemade bombs in their briefcases. The serious-minded wanted to know whether they were genuine Marxists. Did they read Capital and the works of Lenin? Had they a thoroughly socialist economic program? Were they Stalinites or Trotskyites? Or neither? Was their movement really an organic part of the world revolution? Were they true internationalists? Mere tools of Moscow, or primarily nationalists struggling for an independent China? Who were these warriors who had fought so long, so fiercely, so courageously, and, as admitted by observers of every color, and privately by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's own followers, on the whole, so invincibly? What made them fight like that? What held them up? What was the revolutionary basis of their movement? What were the hopes and aims and dreams that had made of them the incredibly stubborn warriors, incredible compared with the history of compromise that is China, who had endured hundreds of battles, blockade, salt shortage, famine, disease, epidemic, and finally the long march of 6,000 miles, in which they crossed 12 provinces of China, broke through thousands of Kuomintang troops, and triumphantly emerged at last into a new base in the northwest. Who were their leaders? Were they educated men with a fervent belief in an ideal, an ideology, and a doctrine? Social prophets, or mere ignorant peasants, blindly fighting for an existence? What kind of man was Mao Zedong, number one, quote, red bandit on Nanjing's list, for whose capture, dead or alive, Chiang Kai-shek offered a reward of $250,000 silver dollars? What went on inside that highly priced Oriental head? Or was Mao really already dead, as Nanjing officially announced? What was Zhou like, the commander-in-chief of the Red Army whose life had the same values in Nanjing? What about Lin Biao, the 28-year-old Red tactician whose famous First Red Army Corps was said never to have suffered a defeat? Where did he come from? Who were the many other Red leaders repeatedly reported dead, only to reappear in the news, unscathed and commanding new forces against the Kuomintang? What explained the Red Army's remarkable record of resistance for 9 years against vastly superior military combinations, lacking any industrial base, big cannon, gas, airplanes, money, the modern techniques which Nanjing had utilized in its wars against them? How had these Reds survived and increased their following? What military tactics did they use? How were they instructed? Who advised them? Were there some Russian military geniuses among them who led the outmaneuvering not only of all Kuomintang commanders sent against them, but also of Chiang Kai-shek's large and expensive staff of German advisors, headed first by General von Seeckt and later by General von Falkenhausen? What was a Chinese Soviet like? Did the peasants support it? If not, what held it together? To what degree did the Reds carry out socialism in districts where they had consolidated their power? Why hadn't the Red Army taken big cities? Did this prove that it wasn't a genuine proletarian-led movement, but fundamentally remained a peasant rebellion? How was it possible to speak of communism or socialism in China, where over 80% of the population was still agrarian, where industrialism was still in infant garments, if not infantile paralysis? How did the Reds dress, eat, play, love, work? What were their marriage laws? Were women nationalized, as Kuomintang publicists asserted? What was a Chinese Red factory? A Red dramatic society? How did they organize their economy? What about public health, recreation, education, Red culture? What was the strength of the Red Army? 500,000, as the Comintern publications boasted? If so, why had it not seized power? Where did it get arms and munitions? Was it a disciplined army? What about its morale? Was it true that officers and men lived alike? If, as General Chiang announced in 1935, Nanjing had destroyed the menace of communist banditry, what explained the fact that in 1937 the Reds occupied a bigger, single, unified territory in China's most strategic northwest than ever before? If the Reds were finished, why did Japan demand, as the famous third point in Kiko Hirota, foreign minister of 1933 to 1936, that Nanjing form an anti-Red pact with Tokyo and Nazi Germany to prevent the Bolshevization of Asia? Were the Reds really anti-imperialist? Did they want war with Japan? Would Moscow support them in such a war? Or were their fierce anti-Japanese slogans only a trick and a desperate attempt to win public sympathy? The last cry of demoralized traitors and bandits, as the eminent Dr. Hu Shi nervously assured his excited students in Beijing. What were the military and political perspectives of the Chinese Communist movement? What was the history of its development? Could it succeed? And just what would success mean to us, to Japan? What would be the effect of this tremendous mutation upon a fifth, some said a fourth, of the world's inhabitants? What changes would it produce in world politics, in world history? How would it affect the vast British, American, and other foreign investment in China? Indeed, had the Reds any foreign policy at all? Finally, what was the meaning of the Communists' offer to form a national united front in China and stop civil war? For some time it had seemed ridiculous that not a single non-communist observer could answer those questions with confidence, accuracy, or facts based on personal investigation. Here was a story growing in interest and importance every day. He was the story of China. As newspaper correspondents admitted to each other between dispatches sent out on trivial side issues, yet we were all woefully ignorant about it. To get in touch with communists in the white areas was extremely difficult. Communists over whose heads hung the sentence of death did not identify themselves as such in polite or impolite society. Even in the foreign concessions, Nanjing kept a well-paid espionage system at work. It included, for example, such vigilantes as C. Patrick Givens, former chief red chaser in the British police force of Shanghai's international settlement. Inspector Givens was each year credited with the arrest and subsequent imprisonment or execution after extradition from the settlement by the Kuomintang authorities of scores of alleged communists, the majority of them between the ages of 15 and 25. He was only one of many foreign sleuths hired to spy upon young Chinese radicals and hunt them down in their own country. We all knew what the only way to learn anything about Red China was. It was to go there. We excused ourselves by saying, "没有法子. It can't be done." A few had tried and failed. It was believed impossible. People thought that nobody could enter Red territory and come out alive. Then, in June 1936, a close Chinese friend of mine brought me news of an amazing political situation in northwest China, a situation which was later to culminate in the sensational arrest of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek and to change the current of Chinese history. More important to me then, however, I learned with this news of a possible method of entry to Red territory. It necessitated leaving at once. The opportunity was unique and not to be missed. I decided to take it, and attempted to break a news blockade 9 years old. It is true that there were risks involved, though the reports later published of my death, quote, "killed by bandits," were exaggerated. But against a torrent of horror stories about Red atrocities that had for many years filled the subsidized vernacular and foreign press of China, I had little to cheer me on my way. Nothing, in truth, but a letter of introduction to Mao Zedong, chairman of the Soviet government. All I had to do was to find him. Through what adventures, I did not know. But thousands of lives had been sacrificed in these years of Kuomintang communist warfare. Could one foreign neck be better hazarded than in an effort to discover why? I found myself somewhat attached to the neck in question, but I concluded that the price was not too high to pay. In this melodramatic mood, I set out. 2. Slow Train to Western Peace. It was early June, and Beijing wore the green lace of spring, its thousands of willows and imperial cypresses making the Forbidden City a place of wonder and enchantment. And in many cool gardens, it was impossible to believe in the China of breaking toil, starvation, revolution, and foreign invasion that lay beyond the glittering roofs of the palaces. Here, well-fed foreigners could live in their own little never-never land of whiskey and soda, polo, tennis, and gossip, happily quite unaware of the pulse of humanity outside the great city's silent, insulating walls, as indeed many did. And yet, during the past year, even the oasis of Beijing had been invaded by the atmosphere of struggle that hovered over all China. Threats of Japanese conquest had provoked great demonstrations of the people, especially among the enraged youth. A few months earlier, I'd stood under the bullet-pitted Tartar wall and seen 10,000 students gather, defiant of the gendarmes' clubbings, to shout in a mighty chorus, "Resist Japan! Resist the demands of Japanese imperialism for the separation of North China from the South." All Beijing's defensive masonry could not prevent reverberations of the Chinese Red Army's sensational attempt to march through Shanxi to the Great Wall, ostensibly to begin a war against Japan for recovery of the lost territories. This somewhat quixotic expedition had been promptly blocked by 11 divisions of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's crack new army, but that had not prevented patriotic students from courting imprisonment and possible death by massing in the streets and uttering the forbidden slogans. "Cease civil war! Cooperate with the communists to resist Japan! Save China!" One midnight I climbed aboard a dilapidated train, feeling a little ill, but in a state of high excitement. Excitement because before me lay a journey of exploration into a land hundreds of years and hundreds of miles removed from the medieval splendors of the Forbidden City. I was bound for Red China, and a little ill because I had taken all the inoculations available. A microbe's eye view of my bloodstream would have revealed a macabre cavalcade. My arms and legs were shot with smallpox, typhoid, cholera, typhus, and plague germs. All 5 diseases were prevalent in the northwest. Moreover, alarming reports had lately told of the spread of bubonic plague in Shanxi province, one of the few spots on Earth where it was endemic. My immediate destination was Xianfu, which means Western Peace. Xianfu was the capital of Shanxi province. It was 2 tiresome days and nights by train to the southwest of Beijing, and it was the western terminus of the Longhai Railway. From there, I planned to go northward and enter the Soviet districts, which occupied the very heart of Daxi Bay, China's great northwest. Luozhuan, a town about 150 miles north of Xianfu, then marked the beginning of Red Territory in Shanxi. Everything north of it, except strips of territory along the main highways and some points which will be noted later, was already dyed red, with Luozhuan roughly the southern, and the Great Wall the northern extremities of red control in Shanxi. Both the eastern and western red frontiers were formed by the Yellow River. Coming down from the fringes of Tibet, the wide, muddy stream flows northward through Gansu and Ningxia, and above the Great Wall into the province of Suiyuan, Inner Mongolia. Then, after many miles of uncertain wandering, toward the east it turns southward again, to pierce the Great Wall and form the boundary between the provinces of Shanxi and Shanxi. It was within this great bend of China's most treacherous river that the Soviets then operated, in northern Shanxi, northeastern Gansu, and southeastern Ningxia. And by a strange sequence of history, this region almost corresponded to the original confines of the birthplace of China. Near here, the Chinese first formed and unified themselves as a people, thousands of years ago. In the morning I inspected my travelling companions and found a youth and a handsome old man with a wisp of grey beard sitting opposite me, sipping bitter tea. Presently the youth spoke to me, in formalities at first, and then inevitably of politics. I discovered that his wife's uncle was a railway official and that he was travelling with a pass. He was on his way back to Sichuan, his native province, which he had left 7 years before. But he was not sure that he would be able to visit his hometown after all. Bandits were reported to be operating near there. You mean the Reds? Oh no, not the Reds. Although there are Reds in Sichuan too. No, I mean bandits. But aren't the Reds also bandits? I asked out of curiosity. The newspapers always call them Red Bandits or Communist Bandits. Ah, but you must know that the editors must call them bandits because they are ordered to by Nanjing, he explained. If they called them communists or revolutionaries, that would prove they were communists themselves. But in Sichuan, don't people fear the Reds as much as the bandits? Well, that depends. The rich men fear them, and the landlords, and the officials and tax collectors, yes. But the peasants do not fear them. Sometimes they welcome them. Then he glanced apprehensively at the old man, who sat listening intently, and yet seemingly not to listen. You see, he continued, the peasants are too ignorant to understand that the Reds only want to use them. They think the Reds really mean what they say. But they don't mean it. My father wrote to me that they did abolish usury and opium in the Songban, which is in Sichuan, and that they redistributed the land there. So you see, they are not exactly bandits. They have principles, all right, but they are wicked men. They kill too many people. Then, surprisingly, the greybeard lifted his gentle face, and with perfect composure made an astonishing remark. 杀不够, he said. They don't kill enough. We both looked at him flabbergasted. Unfortunately, the train was nearing Zhou, where I had a transfer to the Longhai line, and I was obliged to break off the discussion. But I have ever since wondered with what deadly evidence this Confucian-looking old gentleman would have supported his startling contention. I wondered about it all the next day of travel, as we climbed slowly through the weird levels of low-ass hills in Henan and Shanxi, and until my train, this one still new and very comfortable, rolled up to the new and handsome railway station at Xianfu. Soon after my arrival, I went to call on General Yang Huzheng, Pacification Commissioner of Shanxi Province. Until a couple of years before, General Yang had been undisputed monarch of those parts of Shanxi not controlled by the Reds. A former bandit, he rose to authority via the route that had put many of China's ablest leaders in office, and on the same highway he was said to have accumulated the customary fortune. But recently he had been obliged to divide his power with several other gentlemen in the northwest. For in 1935 the young marshal, Zhang Xueliang, who used to be ruler of Manchuria, had brought his Dongbei army into Shanxi and assumed office in Xianfu as supreme red chaser in these parts, vice-commander of the National Bandit Suppression Commission. And to watch the young marshal had come Shao Lizi, an acolyte of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. The Honorable Shao was governor of Shanxi, A delicate balance of power was maintained between these figures and still others. Tugging strings behind all of them was the redoubtable Generalissimo himself, who sought to extend his dictatorship to the northwest and liquidate not only the communist-led revolution, but also the troops of old Yang Huzheng and young Chang Xueliang by the simple process of using each to destroy the other. 3 acts of a brilliant politico-military drama, the main stratagem of which Chiang evidently believed was understood only by himself, and it was that error in calculation, a little too much haste in pursuit of the purpose, a little too much confidence in his adversary's stupidity, which was in a few months to land Chiang Kai-shek a prisoner in Xianfu at the mercy of all 3. I found General Yang in a newly finished stone mansion, just completed at a cost of $50,000. He was living in this many-chambered vault, the official home of the Pacification Commission, without a wife. Yang Huzheng, like many Chinese in this transitional period, was burdened with domestic infelicity, for he was a 2-wife man. The first was the lily-footed wife of his youth, betrothed to him by his parents in Buzheng. The second, as vivacious and courageous a woman as Madame Chiang Kai-shek, was a pretty young mother of 5 children, modern and progressive, a former communist, they said, and the girl that Yang had chosen himself. It seemed, according to the missionaries, that when he opened his new home, each of his wives had presented him with the same minimum demand. Each detested each other. Each had borne him sons and had the right to be legal wife, and each resolutely refused to move into the stone mansion unless the other stayed behind. To an outsider, the case looked simple. A divorce or a 3rd wife was the obvious solution. But General Yang had not made up his mind, and so he still lived alone. His dilemma was a not uncommon one in modern China. Chiang Kai-shek had faced a similar issue when he married rich American-educated Song Meiling, who, as a Methodist, was not prepared to accept polygamy. Chiang had finally divorced his first wife, the mother of his son Jiang Guo, and pensioned off his 2 concubines. The decision was highly approved by the missionaries who had ever since prayed for his soul. Nevertheless, this way out, a new-fangled idea imported from the West, was still frowned upon by many Chinese. Old Yang, having risen from the people, was probably less concerned over the disposal of his soul than the traditions of his ancestors, and it must not be supposed that Yang's early career as a bandit necessarily disqualified him as a leader. Such assumptions could not be made in China, where a career of banditry in early youth often indicated a man of strong character and purpose. A look at Chinese history showed that some of China's ablest patriots were at one time or another labeled bandits. The fact was that many of the worst rogues, scoundrels, and traitors had climbed to power under cover of respectability. The putrid hypocrisy of Confucian maxims and the priestcraft of the Chinese classics, though they had very often utilized the good strong arm of an honest bandit in doing so. General Yang's history as a revolutionary suggested a rugged peasant who might once have had high dreams of making a big change in his world, but who, finding himself in power, looked vainly for a method and grew weary and confused, listening to the advice of the mercenaries who gathered around him. But if he had such dreams, he did not confide them to me. He declined to discuss political questions, and courteously delegated one of his secretaries to show me the city. He was also suffering from a severe headache and rheumatism when I last saw him, and in the midst of his sea of troubles, I was not one to insist upon asking him nettling questions. On the contrary, in his dilemma, he had all my sympathy. So, after a brief interview with him, I discreetly retired to seek some answers from the Honourable Governor Shao Lizi. Governor Shao received me in the garden of his spacious yamen, cool and restful after the parching heat of Xian's dusty streets. I had last seen him 6 years before, when he was Chiang Kai-shek's personal secretary, and at that time he had assisted me in an interview with the Generalissimo. Since then he had risen rapidly in the Kuomintang. He was an able man, well educated, and the Generalissimo had now bestowed upon him the honours of a governorship. But poor Shao, like many another civil governor, did not rule much beyond the provincial capital's grey walls, the outlying territory being divided by General Yang and the young marshal. The Honourable Shao had once been a communist bandit himself. He had played a pioneer role in the Chinese Communist Party. In those days it was fashionable to be a communist, and nobody was very sure exactly what it meant, except that many bright young men were communists. Later on, he had recanted. After 1927, it had become very clear what it meant, and one could have one's head removed for it. Zhou then became a devout Buddhist, and subsequently displayed no further signs of heresy. He was one of the most charming gentlemen in China. How were the Reds getting along, I asked him. There are not many left. Those in Shanxi are only remnants. Then the war continues, I asked. No, at present there is little fighting in North Shanxi. The Reds are moving into Ningxia and Gansu. They seem to want to connect with Outer Mongolia. He shifted the conversation to the situation in the southwest, where insurgent generals were then demanding an anti-Japanese expedition. I asked him whether he thought China should fight Japan. Can we? He demanded. And then the Buddhist governor told me exactly what he thought about Japan. Not for publication, just as every Kuomintang official would then tell you his opinion of Japan. Not for publication. A few months after this interview, poor Zhou was to be put on the spot on this question of war with Japan, along with his generalissimo, by some rebellious young men of Marshal Jiang Xiliang's army, who refused to be reasonable and take, maybe someday, for an answer any longer. And Zhao's diminutive wife, a returned student from Moscow, and a former communist herself, was to be cornered by some of the insurrectionists and make a plucky fight to resist arrest. But Zhou revealed no premonition of all this in our talk, and an exchange of views having brought us perilously near agreement, it was time to leave. I had already learned from Xiao Lizi what I wanted to know. He had confirmed the word of my Beijing informant, that fighting had temporarily halted in North Shanxi. Therefore it should be possible to go to the front, if properly arranged. 3. Some Han bronzes. Some 6 months after my arrival in Xianfu, the crisis in the northwest was to explode in a manner no one had anticipated, so that the whole world was made dramatically aware of an amazing alliance between the big army under Marshal Jiang Xiliang and the bandits whom he had been ordered as Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Communist Suppression Forces to destroy. But in June 1936, the outside world was still in complete ignorance of these strange developments, and even in the headquarters of Chiang Kai-shek's own blue-shirt gendarmes, who controlled the Xianfu police, nobody knew exactly what was taking place. Some 300 communists were imprisoned in the city's jail, and the blue shirts were hunting for more. An atmosphere of extreme tension prevailed. Spies and counter-spies were everywhere. But there is no longer any necessity to remain covert about those exciting days, with the secrets of which I was perforce entrusted, so here it can be told. I had never seen a Red Army man before I arrived in Xianfu. The man in Beijing, who had written for me in invisible ink the letter addressed to Mao Zedong, was, I knew, a Red commander, but I had not seen him. The letter had reached me through a third person, an old friend. But besides this letter, I had only one hope of a connection in the northwest. I had been instructed simply to go to a hotel in Xianfu, take a room there, and await a visit from a gentleman who would call himself Huang, but about whom I knew nothing else. Nothing, except that he would arrange for me to enter the Red Districts by way of the private aeroplane I was promised of Jiang Xiliang. A few days after, I put up in the hotel a large, somewhat florid and rotund, but strongly built and dignified Chinese man, wearing a long grey silk gown, entered my open door and greeted me in excellent English. He looked like a prosperous merchant, but he introduced himself as Wang, mentioned the name of my Beijing friend, and otherwise established that he was the man I awaited. In the week that followed, I discovered that Wang alone was worth the trip to Xianfu. I spent 4 or 5 hours a day listening to his yarns and reminiscences, and to his more serious explanations of the political situation. He was wholly unexpected. Educated in a missionary school in Shanghai, he had been prominently identified with the Christian community and once had a church of his own, and, as I was later to learn, was known amongst the communists as Wang Mu Shi, Wang the Pastor. Like many successful Christians of Shanghai, he had been a member of the Jingbang, and he knew everyone from Chiang Kai-shek, also a former member, down to Du Yesheng, the Jingbang chieftain. He had once been a high official in the Kuomintang, but I cannot even now disclose his real name. For some time, Pastor Wang, having deserted his congregation and officialdom, had been working with the Reds. How long I do not know. It was a kind of secret and unofficial ambassador to the courts of various militarists and officials whom the communists were trying to win over to understanding and support of their anti-Japanese National Front proposals. With Zhang Xueliang, at least, he had been successful. And here some background is necessary to illuminate the basis of the secret understanding which had at this time been reached. Zhang Xueliang was until 1931 the popular, gambling, generous, modern-minded, golf-playing, dope-using, paradoxical warlord dictator of the 30 million people of Manchuria, confirmed in the office he had inherited from his ex-bandit father Jiang Zuolin by the Kuomintang government at Nanjing, which had also given him the title Vice Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of China. In September 1931, Japan set out to conquer the northeast, and Zhang's reverses began. When the invasion commenced, young Marshal Zhang was in the Beijing Union Hospital, below the wall, recovering from typhoid and in no condition to meet this crisis alone. He leaned heavily on Nanjing and his blood-sworn elder brother, Chiang Kai-shek, the Generalissimo. But Chiang Kai-shek, who lacked adequate means to fight Japan and the Reds, urged reliance on the League of Nations. Zhang Xueliang took the Generalissimo's counsel and Nanjing's orders. As a result, he lost his homeland, Manchuria, after only token resistance was offered by his retreating troops. Nanjing propaganda had made it appear that the non-resistance policy was the young marshal's idea, whereas the record showed that it was the government's explicit order. The sacrifice enabled the Generalissimo to hold his own shaky regime together in Nanjing and begin a new annihilation campaign against the Reds. That was how the Manchurian troops, known in China as the Dongbei, meaning northeastern, army, moved south of the Great Wall into China proper. The same thing happened when Japan invaded Jiehou. Zhang Xueliang was not in the hospital then, but he should have been. Nanjing sent no support to him and made no preparations for defense. The Generalissimo, to avoid war, was ready to see Jiehou fall to Japan too, and so it did. Zhang Xueliang got the blame and docilely played the goat when somebody had to resign to appease an infuriated populace. It was Chang or Zhang, and the latter bowed and departed. He went to Europe for a year to study the conditions. The most important thing that happened to Zhang Xueliang while he was in Europe was not that he saw Mussolini and Hitler and met Ramsay MacDonald, but it was that for the first time in several years he found himself a healthy man, cured of the dope habit. Some years before he had taken up opium, as many Chinese generals did, between battles. To break himself of the habit was not easy. His doctor assured him he could be cured by injections. He was freed of the craving of opium, all right, but when the doctor got through with him, the young marshal was a morphine addict. When I first met Zhang at Mukden in 1929, he was the world's youngest dictator, and he still looked fairly well. He was thin, his face somewhat drawn and jaundiced-looking, but his mind was quick and energetic. He seemed full of exuberance. He was openly anti-Japanese, and he was eager to perform miracles in driving Japan from China and modernizing Manchuria. Several years later, his physical condition was much worse. One of his doctors in Beijing told me that he was spending $200 a day on medicine, a special preparation of morphine which theoretically could be tapered off. But in Shanghai, just before he left for Europe, Zhang Xueliang began to cure himself of the drug habit. When he returned to China in 1934, his friends were pleased and amazed. He had put on weight and muscle. There was colour in his cheeks. He looked 10 years younger, and people saw in him traces of the brilliant leader of his youth. He had always possessed a quick, realistic mind, and now he gave it a chance to develop. At Hankou, he resumed command of the Dongbei army, which had been shifted to central China to fight the Reds. It was a tribute to his popularity that, despite his errors of the past, his army enthusiastically welcomed him back. Zhang adopted a new routine: up at 6, hard exercise, daily drill and study, simple food and Spartan habits, and direct personal contact with the subalterns as well as officers of his troops, which still numbered around 140,000 men. A new Dongbei army began to emerge. Skeptics gradually became convinced that the young marshal had again become a man worth watching, and took seriously the vow he had made on his return, that his whole life would be devoted to the task of recovering Manchuria and erasing the humiliation of his people. Meanwhile, Zhang had not lost faith in the Generalissimo. In their entire relationship, Zhang had never wavered in his loyalty to the older man, whose regime he had 3 times saved from collapse, and in whose judgment and sincerity he placed full confidence. He evidently believed Chiang Kai-shek when he said that he was preparing to recover Manchuria and would yield no more territory without resistance. In 1935, Japan's militarists continued their aggression. The puppet regime of East Hubei was set up, part of the Chaha was annexed, and demands were made for the separation of North China from the south, to which Nanjing partly acquiesced. Ominous discontent rumbled among the young marshal's officers and men, especially after his troops were shifted to the northwest to continue to wage an unpopular civil war against the Red Army, while Japanese attrition continued almost unopposed. After months of fighting the Reds in the south, several important realizations had come to the young marshal and some of his officers, that the bandits they were fighting were in reality led by an able, patriotic, anti-Japanese commander, that this process of communist extermination might last for many more years, that it was impossible to resist Japan while the anti-Red wars continued, and that meanwhile the Dongbei army was rapidly being reduced and disbanded in battles which were to it devoid of meaning. Nevertheless, when Zhang shifted his headquarters to the northwest, he began an energetic campaign against the Reds. For a while he had some success, but in October and November 1935, the Dongbei army suffered serious defeats, reportedly losing 2 whole divisions, the 101st and 109th, and part of a third, the 110th. Thousands of Dongbei soldiers turned over to the Red Army. Many officers were also taken captive and held for a period of anti-Japanese tutelage. When those officers were released and returned to Xi'an, they brought back to the young marshal glowing accounts of the morale and organization in the Soviet districts, but especially of the Red Army's sincerity in wanting to stop civil war, unify China by peaceful democratic methods, and unite to oppose Japanese imperialism. Zhang was impressed. He was impressed, even more, by reports from his divisions that the sentiment throughout the whole army was turning against war with the Reds, whose slogans, "Chinese must not fight Chinese," and "Unite with us and fight back to Manchuria," were infecting the rank and file of the entire Dongbei army. In the meantime, Zhang himself had been strongly influenced to the left. Many of the students in his Dongbei University had come to Xi'an and were working with him, and among these were some communists. After the Japanese demands in Beijing of December 1935, he had sent word to the north that all anti-Japanese students, regardless of their political beliefs, could find haven in Xianfu. While anti-Japanese agitators elsewhere in China were being arrested by agents of the Nanjing government, in Shanxi they were encouraged and protected. Some of Zhang's younger officers had been much influenced by the students also, and when the captured officers returned from the Red districts and reported that open anti-Japanese mass organizations were flourishing there, and described the Reds' patriotic propaganda among the people, Zhang began to think more and more of the Reds as natural allies rather than enemies. It was at this point, early in 1936, Pastor Wang told me that he one day called on Zhang Xieliang and opened an interview by declaring, "I have come to borrow your aeroplane to go to the Red districts." Zhang jumped up and stared in amazement. "What? You dare to come here and make such a request? Do you realize you can be shot for this?" The pastor elaborated. He explained that he had contacts with the communists and knew things which Zhang should know. He talked for a long time about their changing policies, about the necessity for a united China to resist Japan, about the Reds' willingness to make big concessions in order to influence Nanjing to resist Japan, a policy which the Reds realized they could not, alone, make effective. He proposed that he should arrange for a further discussion of these points between Zhang and certain Red leaders. And to all of this, after his first surprise, Zhang listened attentively. He had, for some time, been thinking that he could make use of the Reds. They also evidently believed they could make use of him. Very well. Perhaps they could utilize each other on the basis of common demands for an end to civil war and united resistance to Japan. The pastor did, after all, fly to Yan'an, North Shanxi, in the young marshal's private aeroplane. He entered Soviet China and returned with a formula for negotiation, and a short time later Zhang Xieliang himself flew up to Yan'an, met Zhou Enlai, and after long and detailed discussions with him, became convinced, according to Wang, of the Reds' sincerity and of the sanity and practicability of their proposals for a united front. First steps in the implementation of the Dongbei Communist Agreement included the cessation of hostilities in Shanxi. Neither side was to move without notifying the other. The Reds sent several delegates to Xianfu, who put on Dongbei uniforms, joined Jiang Xueliang's staff, and helped reorganize political training methods in his army. A new school was opened at Wangzhuxun, where Zhang's lower officers went through intensified courses in politics, economics, social science, and detailed and statistical study of how Japan had conquered Manchuria and what China had lost thereby. Hundreds of radical students flocked to Xi'an and entered another anti-Japanese political training school, at which the young marshal also gave frequent lectures. Something like the political commissar system used in Soviet Russia and by the Chinese Red Army was adopted in the Dongbei Army. Some aging higher officers inherited from the Manchurian days were sacked. To replace them, Jiang Xueliang promoted radical, younger officers, to whom he now looked for his main support in building a new army. Many of the corrupt sycophants who had surrounded Zhang during his playboy years were also replaced by eager and serious-minded students from Dongbei University. Such changes developed in close secrecy, made possible by Zhang's semi-autonomy as a provincial warlord. Although the Dongbei troops no longer fought the Reds, there were Nanjing troops along the Shanxi-Xianxi border, and in Gansu and Ningxia, and some fighting continued in those regions. No word of the truce between Zhang and the communists crept into the press, and although Chiang Kai-shek's spies in Xi'an knew that something was fermenting, they could get few details of its exact nature. Occasional trucks arrived in Xi'an, carrying red passengers, but they looked innocuous. They all wore Dongbei uniforms. The occasional departure of other trucks from Xi'an to the red districts aroused no suspicion. They resembled any other Dongbei truck setting off for the front. It was on just such a truck, Pastor Wang confided to me soon after my arrival, that I would myself be going to the front. The journey by plane was out. Too much risk of embarrassment to the young marshal was involved, for his American pilots might not hold their tongues if a foreigner were dumped on the front and not returned. One morning the pastor called on me with a Dongbei officer, or at any rate a youth wearing the uniform of a Dongbei officer, and suggested a trip to the ancient Han city outside Xi'an. A curtained car waited for us in front of the hotel, and when we got in, I saw in a corner a man wearing dark glasses and the Zhongshan uniform of a Kuomintang official. We drove out to the site of the old palace of the Han dynasty, and there we walked over to the raised mound of earth where the celebrated Han Wu-Ti once sat in his throne room and ruled the earth. Here you could still pick up fragments of tile from those great roofs over 2,000 years ago. Pastor Wang and the Dongbei officer had some words to exchange and stood apart talking. The Kuomintang official, who had sat without speaking during our long dusty drive, came over to me and removed his dark glasses and his white hat. I saw that he was quite young. Under a rim of thick, glossy hair, a pair of intense eyes sparkled at me. A mischievous grin spread over his bronzed face, and one look at him, without those glasses, showed that the uniform was a disguise, that this was no sedentary bureaucrat, but an out-of-doors man of action. He was of medium height and looked slight of strength, so that when he came close to me and suddenly took my arm in a grip of iron, I winced with surprise. There was a pantherish grace about the man's movements. I noticed later a lithe limberness under the stiff formal cut of the suit. He put his face close to mine and grinned and fixed his sharp, burning eyes on me, and held my two arms tightly in that iron grip. Then he wagged his head and comically screwed up his mouth and winked. "Look at me," he whispered, with the delight of a child with a secret. "Look at me. Look at me. Do you recognize me?" I did not know what to think of the fellow. He was so bubbling over about something that his excitement infected me, and I felt foolish because I had nothing to say. Recognize him? I had never met a Chinese like him before in my life. I shook my head apologetically. He released a hand from my arm and pointed a finger at his chest. "Oh, I thought maybe you'd seen my picture somewhere," he said. "Well, I am Dong Fa," he offered. "Dong Fa!" He pulled back his head and gazed at me to see the effect of the bombshell. Dong Fa! Dong Fa! Why, Dong Fa was the chief of the Chinese Red Army security police. And something else. There was a $50,000 bounty on his head. Deng danced with pleasure when he disclosed his identity. He was irrepressible, full of amusement at the situation. He, the notorious communist bandit, living in the very midst of the enemy's camp, thumbing his nose at the spies that hovered everywhere, and he was overjoyed at seeing me. He literally hugged me repeatedly. An American who was going voluntarily into the bandit areas. He offered me everything. Did I want his horse? Oh, what a horse he had. The finest in red china. His pictures. He had a wonderful collection, and it was all mine. His diary. He would send instructions to his wife, who was still in the Soviet areas, to give all this and more to me. And he kept his word. What a man. What a red bandit. Deng Fa was a Cantonese man, the son of a working-class family, and he had once been a foreign-style cook on a Canton Hong Kong steamer. He had been a leader of the great Hong Kong shipping strike, when he was beaten in the chest, and had some ribs broken by a British constable, who did not like pickets. And then he had become a communist, and entered Wanbo, and taken part in the nationalist revolution, until, after 1927, he had joined the Red Army in Jiangxi. We stood for an hour or more on that height, talking and looking down on the green-shrouded grave of an imperial city. How incongruous and yet how logical it was that this place should seem to the communists the one rendezvous where we four could meet safely, the exact spot where 2 millenniums ago Han Wu-Ti had ruled a united China, and so successfully consolidated a people and a culture from the chaos of warring states that their descendants, ever since, had been content to call themselves sons of Han. It was here that Deng told me who would escort me to the Red Districts, how I would travel, how I would live in Red China, and assured me of a warm welcome there. "Aren't you afraid for your head?" I asked as we drove back to the city. Not any more than Zhang Xueliang is," he said. "I'm living with him." 4. Through Red Gates. We left Xianfu before dawn, the high wooden gates of the once golden city swinging open and noisily dragging their chains before the magic of our military pass. In the half-light of pre-dawn, the big army trucks lumbered past the airfield from which expeditions set out for daily reconnaissance and bombing over the Red Lines. To a Chinese traveller, every mile of this road northwards from Xianfu evokes memories of the rich and colourful pageant of his people. It seemed not inappropriate that the latest historical mutation in China, the communist movement, should choose this locale in which to work out a destiny. In an hour we were being ferried across the Wei River, in whose rich valley Confucius's ancestors developed their rice culture and formulated traditions still a power in the folk myth of rural China today. And towards noon we had reached Zunbu. It was near this battlemented city that the towering and terrible figure who first unified China, the Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi, was born some 2,200 years ago. The Emperor Qin first consolidated all of the ancient frontier walls of his country into what remains today the most stupendous masonry on earth, the Great Wall of China. Opium poppies nodded their swollen heads, ready for harvest, along the newly completed motor road, a road already deeply wrinkled with washouts and ruts, so that at times it was scarcely navigable even for our 6-ton Dodge truck. Xianxi had long been a noted opium province. During the Great Northwest Famine, which a few years before had taken a toll of 3 million lives, American Red Cross investigators attributed much of the tragedy to the cultivation of the poppy, forced upon the peasants by provincial monopolies controlled by greedy warlords. The best land being devoted to the poppy, in years of drought, there was a serious shortage of millet, wheat, and corn, the staple cereals of the Northwest. I spent the night on a clay kang, in a filthy hut at Luojuan, with pigs and donkeys quartered in the next room, and rats in my own, and I'm sure we all slept very little. Next morning, a few miles beyond that city, the Loess terraces rose higher and more imposing, and the country was weirdly transformed. The wonderful Loess lands, which cover much of Gansu, Xianxi, Ningxia, and Xiangxi provinces, accounts for the marvelous fertility of these regions, where there is rainfall. For the Loess furnishes an inexhaustible porous topsoil tens of feet deep. Geologists think the Loess is an organic matter blown down in centuries past from Mongolia and from the west by the great winds that rise in Central Asia. Scenically, the result is an infinite variety of queer, embattled shapes, hills like great castles, like rows of mammoth, nicely rounded scones, like ranges torn by some giant hand, leaving behind the imprint of angry fingers. Fantastic, incredible, and sometimes frightening shapes. A world configurated by a mad god, and sometimes a world also of strange surrealist beauty. And though we saw fields and cultivated land everywhere, we seldom saw houses. The peasants were tucked away in those low-s hills also. Throughout the northwest, as had been the habit of centuries, men lived in homes dug out of the hard, fudge-coloured cliffs, yao fang, or cave houses, as the Chinese call them. But they were no caves in the Western sense. Cool in the summer, warm in the winter, they were easily built and easily cleaned. Even the wealthiest landlords often dug their homes in the hills. Some of them were many-roomed edifices, gaily furnished and decorated with stone floors and high-ceilinged chambers, lighted through rice-paper windows open in the walls of earth, also athwart the stout, black-lacquered doors. Once, not far from Luojuan, a young Dongbei officer who rode beside me in the cavorting track pointed to such a Yaofang Sun, a cave village. It lay only a mile or so distant from the motor road, just across a deep ravine. "They are Reds," he revealed. "One of our detachments was sent over there to buy millet a few weeks ago, and those villagers refused to sell us a catty of it. The stupid soldiers took some by force. As they retired, the peasants shot at them." He swung his arms in an arc including everything on each side of the highway, so carefully guarded by dozens of baolei, hilltop machine gun nests manned by Kuomintang troops. "Hongfei," he said. "Everything out there is Red Bandit territory." I gazed toward the spaces indicated with keener interest, for it was into that horizon of unknown hill and upland that I intended, within a few hours, to make my way. On the road we passed part of the 105th Division, all Manchurians, moving back from Yan'an to Luojuan. They were lean and sturdy youths, most of them taller than the average Chinese soldier. At a roadside inn we stopped to drink tea, and we sat down near several of them who were resting. They were just returning from Wayabao in northern Shanxi, where there had been a skirmish with the Reds. I overheard scraps of conversation between them. They were talking about the Reds. "They eat a lot better than we do," one argued. "Yes, eat the flesh of the Lao Bai Xing," another replied. "Never mind that. A few landlords, it's all to the good." "Who thanked us for coming to Wayabao? The landlords. Isn't it a fact? Why should we kill ourselves for these rich men? They say more than 3,000 of our Dongbei men are with them now. Another thing on their side. Why should we fight our own people, when none of us want to fight anybody unless it's the Japanese, huh?" An officer approached, and his promising conversation came to an end. The officer ordered them to move on. They picked up their rifles and trudged off down the road. Soon afterwards we drove away. Early in the afternoon of the second day, we reached Yan'an, where North Shanxi's single road fit for wheeled traffic came to an end, about 400 li more or less south of the Great Wall. It was a historic town. Through it, in centuries past, had come the nomadic raiders from the north, and through it swept the great Mongol cavalry of Genghis Khan in its ride of conquest towards Xianfu. Yan'an was ideally suited for defense. Cradled in a bowl of high, rock-ribbed hills, its stout walls crawled up to the very tops. Attached to them now, like wasps' nests, were newly made fortifications, where machine guns bristled toward the Reds not far beyond. The road and its immediate environs were then held by Dongbei troops, but until recently Yan'an had been completely cut off. The Reds had turned upon their enemy the blockade which the Generalissimo enforced against themselves, and hundreds reportedly had died of starvation. The long red siege of Yan'an had been lifted a few weeks before I arrived, but signs of it were still evident in the famished-looking inhabitants and the empty shelves or barred doors of shops. Little food was available, and prices were alpine. What could be bought at all had been secured as a result of a temporary truce with the Red partisans. In return for an agreement not to take the offensive against the Soviet districts on this front, the Soviet peasants now sold grain and vegetables to the hungry anti-Red troops. I had my credentials for a visit to the front. My plan was to leave the city early next morning and go toward the white lines where the troops were merely holding their positions without attempting any advance. Then I meant to branch off on one of the mountain lanes over which, I had been told, merchants smuggled their goods in and out of the Soviet regions. To state precisely the manner in which, just as I had hoped, I did pass the last century and enter no man's land, might have caused serious difficulties for the Kuomintang adherents who assisted me on my way. Suffice it to say that my experience proved once more that anything is possible in China, if it is done in the Chinese manner, for by 7 o'clock next morning I had really left the last Kuomintang machine gun behind and was walking through the thin strip of territory that divided red from white. With me was a single muleteer who had been hired for me by a Manchurian colonel in Yan'an. He was to carry my scant belongings, bedding roll, a little food, 2 cameras and 24 rolls of film, to the first Red partisan outpost. I did not know whether he himself was a red bandit or a white bandit, but bandit he certainly looked. All this territory having for several years alternately been controlled by armies of both colours, it was quite possible for him to have been either, or perhaps both. For 4 hours we followed a small, winding stream and did not see any sign of human life. There was no road at all, but only the bed of the stream that rushed swiftly between high walls of rock, above which rose swift hills of loess. It was the perfect setting for the blotting out of a too inquisitive foreign devil. A disturbing factor was the muleteer's frequently expressed admiration of my cowhide shoes. "Dao la!" he suddenly shouted around his ear, as the rock walls at last gave way and opened out into a natural valley, green with young wheat. "We have arrived." Relieved, I gazed beyond him and saw, in the side of a hill, a loess village, where blue smoke curled from the tall clay chimneys that stood up like long fingers against the face of the cliff. In a few minutes we were there. A young farmer who wore a turban of white toweling on his head and a revolver strapped to his waist came out and looked at me in astonishment. Who was I, and what did I want? "I'm an American journalist," I said, in conformance with the instructions Wang the pastor had given me. "I want to see the local chief of the Poor People's League." He looked at me blankly and replied, "Hai Pa." Hai Pa, in any other Chinese I had ever heard, had only one meaning. "I'm afraid." If he is afraid, I thought to myself, what the devil am I supposed to feel? But his appearance believed his words. He looked completely self-assured. He turned out to be the Lo Fu and asked who I was. The muleteer repeated what I had said, adding a few flourishes of his own. With relief, I saw the young farmer's face soften, and then I noticed that he was really a good-looking young man with fine bronzed skin and good white teeth. He did not seem to belong to the race of timid peasants of China elsewhere. There was a challenge in his sparkling, merry eyes, and a certain bravado. He slowly moved his hand away from his revolver butt and smiled. "I am that man," he said. "I am the chief. Come inside and drink some hot tea." These Shanxi hill people had a dialect of their own, full of slurred colloquialisms, but they understood Paihua or Mandarin Chinese, and most of their own speech was quite comprehensible to an outlander. After a few more attempts at conversation with the chief, he began to show understanding, and we made good progress. Occasionally into our talk, however, would creep this Hai Pa business. For a while I was too disconcerted to ask him just what he feared. When I finally did probe into the matter, I discovered that Hai Pa in the dialect of the Shanxi Hills is equivalent of Buzhidao in Mandarin Chinese. It simply means, "don't understand." My satisfaction at this discovery was considerable. Seated on a felt-covered kang, I told my host more about myself and my plans. In a short time he seemed reassured. I wanted to go to Enlai, the county seat, where I then believed Soviet Chairman Mao Zedong to be. Could he give me a guide and a muleteer? Certainly, he agreed, but I should not think of moving in the heat of day. The sun had already climbed to its zenith. It was really very hot. I looked tired, and, meanwhile, had I eaten? Actually, I was ravenous. Without any further ceremony, I accepted this invitation to a first meal with the Red Bandit. My muleteer was anxious to return to Yan'an, and, paying him off, I bade him goodbye. It was a farewell to my last link with the white world for many weeks to come. I had crossed the red Rubicon. I was now at the mercy of Mr. Liu Longhuo. Liu the Dragonfire, as I learned the young peasant was called, and likewise at the mercy of his tough-looking comrades who had begun to drift in from the neighbouring Youfang. Similarly clad and armed, they looked at me curiously and laughed at my preposterous accent. Liu offered me tobacco, wine, and tea, and plied me with numerous questions. He and his friends examined with close interest, interrupted by exclamations of approval, my camera, my shoes, my woolen stockings, the fabric of my cotton shorts, and, with lengthy admiration, the zipper on my khaki shirt. The general impression seemed to prevail that, however ridiculous it might look, the ensemble evidently served its purposes well enough. I did not know just what communism might mean to these men in practice, and I was prepared to see my belongings rapidly redistributed, but instead I was given the foreign guest treatment. In an hour, a vast platter of scrambled eggs arrived, accompanied by steamed rolls, boiled millet, some cabbage, and my little roast pork. My host apologized for the simplicity of the fare, and I for an inordinate appetite, which later was quite beside the point, as I had to punt my chopsticks at a lively pace to keep up with the good fellows of the Poor People's League. Dragonfire assured me that Enlai was only a few steps, and though I was uneasy about it, I could do nothing but wait, as he insisted. When, finally, a youthful guide appeared, accompanied by a muleteer, it was already past 4 in the afternoon. Before leaving, I ventured to pay Mr. Liu for his food, but he indignantly refused. "You are a foreign guest," he explained, "and you have business with our chairman Mao. Moreover, your money is no good." Glancing at the bill I held out to him, he asked, "Haven't you any Soviet money?" When I replied in the negative, he counted out $1 worth of Soviet paper notes. "Here, you will need this on the road." Mr. Liu accepted a Guomindang dollar in exchange. I thanked him again, and climbed up on the road behind my guide and muleteer. Ahead of me was a narrow escape, and an incident which was later to nourish the rumor that I had been kidnapped and killed by bandits. And, as a matter of fact, bandits, not red but white, were already trailing me behind those silent walls of Loess.